I love those first days of spring when the snowdrops come out, followed by buds on everything else bit by bit. And then finally the daffodils and some other flowers to let us know that spring has really started and it's going to accelerate fast from here. It's our second full year at Bramble Cottage, and although it usually takes at least 3 years to see a garden really come into its own, I'm looking forward to seeing it build up some volume this year from everything that we put in so far. I also want to keep bulking it up as fast as I can, more flowers to the pollinators, fill some gaps, that kind of thing. So I'm getting started as early as possible with a selection of tubers that I've bought online. All of these have some sort of edible property towards the food forest that I'm developing, but several of them will also produce flowers that will be good for pollinators, including a Symphytum Bocking 14, which is a particular strain of Comfrey that's good for composting, but it's also a member of the Boraginaceae family, which bees absolutely love. This rough grassy patch is where I've decided to plant my tubers. I figured it would be easier to have a single area for all my perennial root crops, so that when I'm digging up roots of those I'm not disturbing other plants. But because I want to plant roots here, I'm also going to need to lift the turf on this area rather than use a no-dig method like I've done everywhere else. So I have my work cut out for me. I also plan to use the turf that I lift to build up this sort of hugel mound that I've been developing in the middle of the garden. The lawn at Bramble Cottage was pretty immaculate when we first arrived, but since I took over we've ended up with quite a few dandelions and docks taking root. So I'm having to stop to dig those out as best I can when I come across them. It's actually pretty amazing seeing how the weeds are taking over and the moles have begun visiting since the end of whatever the previous regime was. There were no molehills in this garden when we arrived, and now I get them every day. Though they really mess up the paths and they have pushed out the odd plant, I'm taking a philosophical view because they're doing an amazing job of aerating the soil. Right, so this is as far as I got, and I think I'm going to stop there. Partly for the very obvious reason that this isn't the most exciting job in the world, and now that the sun's finally come out, it's all sort of glowy and green again now, I can do something a bit more interesting, like plant some of the herbaceous perennials I've got, but also partly that I just don't have that many plants, and so I only need enough bare earth to plant the, I think, 4 different root crops that I've got, and this should be sufficient for that for this year. And then I'd rather not uncover the rest of the bed. The whole bed's bigger than what I remembered it was when I thought I was going to do the whole thing, so I only have enough plants for about half of it, and if I leave the other half covered, then that's better than having a bed of bare earth for an entire year until I get more stuff. So I'm going to stop there. Meanwhile, all the turf I've been lifting has made a modest difference to the hugel mound area. To be honest, I'm not really sure what I'm doing with this hugel mound idea. Usually you would bury large quantities of carbon in the middle of a hugel mound, sort of old stumps and bores of wood, that kind of thing. But we don't actually have access to a huge amount of that sort of material here because we don't have any large trees on site that need pruning. So I'm putting woody material as I have it from hedge cutting and that kind of things, but it's pretty lightweight, and for the rest of it I'm just building it up with earth that I find from other areas. It should still help with those plants that don't like sitting with their feet in the high water table we have here in the long run though. And finally, it's time for some plants. This first set of tubers is Tropaeolum tuberosum, which is otherwise known as Mashua. The tubers are edible, but I've never tried them, and apparently they have an acquired aniseed type flavour. However, the leaves and flowers are edible too, and I absolutely love nasturtium leaves from other species. So whilst these are perennial, they're also tender in some parts of the UK, and we do get some pretty heavy frosts here. So what I'll probably do is dig up a bunch of tubers at the end of the year to overwinter indoors, but I'll also leave some in the ground just to see if they sprout again like they can do further south. I'm always an advocate of low maintenance perennial plants if I can get away with it. Next up, we've got Apios americana. So I bought this one last autumn, so I've had it in a pot for most of the winter, and I've just been keeping the soil really lightly damp, and I'm going to find out now what the tuber looks like and put it into its permanent location. This plant is commonly known as Hopniss or groundnut, and it's one of those highly resilient plants that's been touted in recent years as a potential solution for food security because the yield can be potentially really high, it's nutrient dense, it's disease resistant, you know, it's basically got everything going for it. Now for the Bocking 14 Comfrey. This plant does have traditional food uses, and some people do still eat it, but it contains pyrrolizidine alkaloids, which can be really quite harmful, so I'm not growing this one as a food crop as such. For me, it's more for potential medicinal use and then composting, because it adds a huge amount of nutrition if added as a green manure to a compost. This variety, Bocking 14, is one that's recommended to avoid the plant from spreading. It can be a bit of a thug otherwise. Tuber number 4 is probably best known these days as a gourmet vegetable. It's acre, which is from the plant Oxalis tuberosa, and it can be eaten raw or cooked. The raw tuber has a lemony flavour typical of the edible parts of many Oxalis species, but when cooked that goes away and it can taste much more like a potato. Acre is not fully hardy, so I'll treat it the same as the Mashua and dig most of it up at the end of the year, but leave a few in just to see if they survive. Finally, we have the well-known Jerusalem artichoke, or Helianthus tuberosus. This is a member of the daisy family, so it will give us some bright sunny yellow flowers, and then the tubers are also just a mainstay cookable tuber. The only downside to them is that they contain inulin, which humans can't digest, and for some that inulin passes straight through without issue, but for others it can create undesirable side effects, let's say. But it's hardy, perennial, reliable, so it feels like a good crop to include regardless. I hope to experiment with ways of cooking Jerusalem artichoke to reduce the inulin content for those members of my family who are not so keen. That's all of my root crops now in, but because it's been an awful lot of bare earth and mud, I felt like a selection of green things that have also gone in would be a nice way to finish. The rabbits have been upsetting the snowdrops where they grow along the hedge, and we have so many on that side of the site, but absolutely none down this beautiful lane. So I thought I'd take advantage of a clump that was half pushed out of the ground and then transfer it to this area for next year. It was still a bit early and they hadn't begun to fully flower back when I did this, but they actually did great and flowered in their new location this year too. This is a perennial Asturian tree cabbage with the potential to get really tall if I do things right. These are Echinacea purpurea. The mulch on this bed is still pretty raw, so I decided to plant these with a bit of soil from elsewhere just to protect them a bit. This is Daubenton's panache, which is another perennial kale, but clump forming and variegated this time.